Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Shells and Shadows. Today, I have another friend with me, Eli Cohen. Eli is coming in today to tell us his story, his experience, and hopefully we can all learn from him. So, welcome, Eli.
Thanks, Yuta. Happy to be here. My ex girlfriend said I had a face for radio, and I actually made it onto a podcast. So how about that?
First for everything,
There's a
huh?
first for everything. L'chaim.
Let's get a
Good
little
man.
into that. These brand new Let's Do podcast glasses.
That's going to your online shop, right, Yovel?
We'll have a link somewhere.
Perfect. In the show notes.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for coming on the show today. I want to start. Where do we start? I want to
Mm-hmm.
start with your background, who you are, your upbringing. So you were born and raised in Boulder.
Mm-hmm.
What else should people know about you
Yeah,
and your
I'll
story?
I'll keep it short, but my name is Eli Cohen, born and raised in Boulder. These days, if someone's like a native to Boulder, you're kind of like an endangered species, hunted to the brink of extinction. There's not many of us, but born and raised in Boulder. At 18, I moved to Montreal, Canada, and studied at McGill. So I studied finance and did a exchange semester in Bangkok. And my family is Jewish, but very reform. Like my dad would take me to Sunday school, and he would pick me up early and take me skiing, and have a BLT for lunch type of thing. So very reform. But my grandparents are Israeli. My grandmother was in the 1948 War of Independence, and she was a Morse code operator. And my grandfather, this is all on my dad's side. My grandfather was in the U.S. Navy in World War II, and he had experience coming out of the Pacific Theater. And after the war, he went back to LA and he was reading the news and he read about, what's happening in Israel in 1948. So he essentially got there as fast as he could, being a Zionist and Jewish and so forth. So he founded the Shayetet Shloshesrei unit, the Israeli Navy SEAL unit,
Wow.
and he was based in Caesarea and was basically putting bombs on the boats in the Haifa harbor. And so my grandmother was doing Morse code for his unit, and one of those stories where they fight the war, they fall in love, and once the war ended, they were like, we can either stay in Israel where there's really nothing and build this country, or we can leave, go to LA where everything is kind of turnkey and easy, and so that's what they did, and that's where my father was born in Los Angeles. So, as a kid, I never met my grandfather. He passed before I was born, but my grandmother would tell me all these stories about Israel and about the war and about what they endured, and those stories just kind of stuck with me when I was a kid and into my teenage years, and it was always in the back of my mind, like maybe I want to go to Israel, explore my roots, join the IDF, see what that's about, and I never did it. I went to high school and I went to college, and then I was graduating from McGill, and all my friends were going to New York to do investment banking or consulting, and that was the path that I was on. But I kind of realized, I can go do that, and once I'm on that track, you're kind of stuck, right? Like if you're locked into a career, it's really hard to jump away from it if you have a lease and an apartment and yada yada. So I was like, if I want to do something, the time is now. So instead of, going into, finance in New York, I said, I'm going to pause my entire kind of professional life and go do something that I've always wanted to do, but never had the courage to do so. So 2 days after graduation, I moved to Israel. I didn't speak a lick of Hebrew. Like I knew like, three words like shalom, hummus, and
The,
pita,
the, the
probably. The
essentials.
essentials, you can get real far with that. Um, and so moved to Israel, lived on a kibbutz. I did like a pre-army program through Green Sabar, where you have like 18 mismatched teenagers, and for whatever reason they want to leave their lives in America or Canada and move to Israel and become lone soldiers and fight in the IDF. So that's what I did, and learned Hebrew to a certain degree, and got into a special like paratrooper unit, because I think if I'm there, it's might as well like get into the most the hardest, most challenging thing I could do. So um, was in the paratroopers and ultimately got into sniper school and led a sniper team and did all that stuff.
Wow.
So
So when you were contemplating, maybe I go join the IDF, maybe I stay on this path that
Mhm.
all of my peers are on. Um, how did your how did your friends and how did your family react to your decision to kind of shift your direction and heed your call to service?
That's a good question. I think my mom thought that I fell on my head too many times as a kid, which probably I did. But it was not easy. It's like if your parents work so hard to put you through university and, you know, in Boulder or wherever you go to school, and then suddenly you say, actually, I'm not ready for this career path to become, to go into finance or be a CPA or whatever. And you're like, I'm going to go, practice the trumpet all day, every day. And all I want to do is, perform in New York City with trumpet. They'll be like, what the hell? We just invested all this money into you, and you're basically giving us the finger to move on to something entirely new or foreign to you. And that's basically was the reaction from my parents. And my friends all like just thought I was an idiot, or was, I don't know what they thought. But at the end of the day, it didn't really matter. Of course, I wanted my family's blessing, and in the end, I got it, because I think as men, like all we really want are like our mom and dad's blessing. No matter what we do, what career path, who we take as a partner, we just want their blessing. And I think if they withhold that, it cuts deep. I don't know if you've ever felt that before, where
Yeah. No,
and
absolutely. You want to, I mean, your parents have given you everything. You want to be responsible in how you live your life so that you
yeah.
can give back to them for all that they've shown you and love and care and how they've provided for you. I'm curious to know, did you speak to your grandmother about this? Was she alive at this point? Did you get to
It's a good,
run this by her?
yeah, no, I didn't. She passed when I was in high school.
Okay.
So she had no idea that I,
Wow.
went and served in the IDF, and reconnected with her family in Israel, kind of distant second cousins that were just always in Israel, and we talked about them, but we didn't really know them.
Yeah.
So I was kind of the bridge between the American side and the Israeli side. But I think at the end of the day, you kind of know what's in your heart, and even if you don't have the blessing of everyone, or not everyone understands, like, to have the courage to just continue to go on with it, even with all those feelings and that angst and the push and pull. But
Sure.
yeah.
And I had a guest on my podcast. The first guest I had, his name's Theo. He came on about a month and a half ago, and now he's in Israel. He's about to start Mechina before he
Okay.
joins the army. One thing he also mentioned was just this need to get his family's blessing, and he
Mhm.
also did. And they weren't too thrilled at
Yeah.
first, but he did, and he felt like, okay, now I can go and listen to this calling. So
Yeah.
you went to Israel. You learned Hebrew as you went. I relate. I made Aliyah, and it's not an easy process,
No, it's not.
especially jumping into to the army.
Yeah.
What helped ease your transition, and what got you along in that initial stage?
Yeah. I mean, I think probably similar to you, just forging ahead and knowing that you want to make Aliyah and that you're there to stay and you have that staying power. And everything in Israel, there's friction, right? Whether you order, something at a restaurant, or let alone something bureaucratic, there's friction every angle you look, and like nothing is easy there. But that's kind of what makes it fun and more like engaging, and it's what makes Israel uniquely Israel.
It's chaos
Yeah,
sometimes.
it's chaos. It's not even organized chaos. It's just
No.
chaos. Um, but it was something that I wanted to do, and it's like, you're a monkey, strapping yourself into a rocket, and the moment you go to Israel and you make Aliyah, it's like you launch that rocket into space, and it's a one-way ticket. And you're just a little chimp, strapped in. And you're going to the moon, and it's hard to turn back. And once you're there, and you make it happen. But I think being there and for 3 months and learning Hebrew and about the army and doing all the pre-army tryouts and interviews kind of gets you, like, assimilates you, or it's as much of a soft landing as you'll get. Then you enter the military, and like I was a deer in the headlights, and in my team there were like only a couple guys that spoke any English,
Wow.
and one friend in particular, his name is Amir, and he was a bigger guy, but he had the biggest heart, but he's big, and it's like, if you don't make the obstacle course in a certain amount of time, or if you're not able to complete these runs in a certain amount of time, you get kicked out of the paratroopers and you go to a different unit or a regular infantry unit. And so Amir and I had this deal, and he spoke impeccable English, like, very thick, but his vocabulary was like better than ours. I have no idea how. I think he played a lot of
Wow.
like Halo as a kid or something, online. But every evening you have this thing called shatash, where you have an hour to, shower, call your parents, speak to your girlfriend, do whatever you need to do. And during shatash, Amir and I would run around the base or do the obstacle course, just the two of us, just to try to get him fitter and get him to stay in the paratroopers as the training went on and got more challenging. So in exchange, he helped me with all the tests, and we'd be sitting in an auditorium and he'd be like whispering in my ear like, this is what they're talking about and this is how a grenade works and all these things. And he ultimately became, one of my best friends, is now like commander of my reserve unit. Um, but it's those little things and the people that you choose to kind of get you, to pull you along through the training when it's, you're so far from home. I was an outsider, right? I'm just like this American guy that becomes Israeli and joins the army, and I'm, 4 years older than my peers and my commander at the time, and everyone's like, dude, you could be living in New York, dating, going out to bars and
Yeah.
restaurants, but you're actually just here in the desert going on these long marches. And
And these guys all just finished high school
they
and
just finished
whatnot.
high school.
Yeah.
But there were also a couple other guys like me. There was a guy from Belarus, a guy from Germany, a couple other Americans within our paratrooper battalion. And we're just like an island of misfit toys. Everyone looks at us like, why did you choose this route? You could have done so many things with your life, but you came here to eat shit with us and to serve. And I remember we'd be going on these marches where your bag is 80 pounds and it's hot and you don't really have any water. And my friend would run up to me and be like, Eli, remember, you chose this, like, you want to be here. And I'm like, give him the finger, and, we all smile and stuff. But they always made it apparent that I volunteered. But I think that's what makes it even more important when when you don't have to do something, but you choose to be there. And in these paratrooper units or special forces, you choose to be there, and you can always raise your hand and say, actually, I don't want to be here anymore. I want to go, have a desk job, or I want to go do something that's, a standard military service. And I think that's what kind of forges the bond between soldiers, especially as you go through training, because everyone chooses to be there, and you choose who is to your left and who is to your right.
And especially as an American who has, I mean, obviously you have your grandparents, but otherwise your
Yeah.
whole life's here. You don't have any immediate connection to Israel
Right.
besides the fact that my family is Jewish. I'm Jewish.
Mm-hmm.
My grandparents came from there. I think Israelis are sometimes taken aback of like, why are you here? You could just, like you said,
Yeah.
be living your life.
Yeah.
But there's this inner calling of I identify with this country on some deeper level,
Mm-hmm.
and I feel the need to go serve. And I think
Yeah.
Israelis, from my experience, especially post October 7th, they're very shocked at how much we support them.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this idea that like they're alone, they're fighting their fight. But there's people in America who very much are willing to give up everything to help their cause.
Totally. And throughout throughout the war, there'd be volunteers that come from France or Canada and the US, and they're barbecuing for us, or they're giving you, acupuncture treatments. And everyone is like, I think the Israeli, community in general thought that, like, okay, we're really not alone. There's a diaspora of, 14 million Jews in the world, and we are actually in this together. And I don't know what it was like here at CU or on college campus, where, like, did it feel like there was more solidarity than ever before within the Jewish community when you feel like the whole world is against us?
Yeah, the blessing that came out of the terrible tragedy and
Mm-hmm.
the terrible fear amongst our community was an intense unity that I still can't really explain to this day. It was just this feeling in the air. If you were around, you knew it.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody who was there at these vigils that we held and at these Shabbat dinners post October
Yeah.
7th, everyone was more connected. I was more connected than we'd ever been
Mm-hmm.
before. And that's something that I think people experience all over
And
the
is
world.
it connection to each other? Is it connection to Judaism? Connection to Israel?
I think it's all of them.
Okay.
Connection to each other in a community, in a communal sense.
Yeah.
Connection to Israel and Judaism, because whether you have been born and raised as a practicing Jew or you have no identification with the
Mhm.
entire thing as a whole, part of you feels like something has been taken and torn out of you,
Yeah.
part of your heart, and you want to do something about it. You want to feel drawn towards it.
Yeah.
So that kind of takes me into your second
Mhm.
stage of service. You finished your first round of
Yeah.
army, you moved back to America. What was your life like, and then what sort of
Yeah.
changed?
So I served a couple years in the IDF, finished as sniper team commander and the paratroopers, and we were on the Gaza border, we were in the West Bank, a little bit in Lebanon, etc. And then service ends. A couple weeks later, I moved back to the U.S. and I go to New York and I start the investment banking career that I kind of postponed. And I remember, excuse me, I remember doing this interview process for investment banks, and they're like, this is a really hard job. Like, you're going to work 80-hour weeks and it's going to be extremely challenging, et cetera. And all the people applying for these jobs went to Ivy League schools and, graduates of UPenn, et cetera. And, during the interview process, I would just say, well, nothing can be as hard as the last job I had, which was, serving in the IDF where you're always on. Investment banking, you might work, 12, 14-hour days, but in the army, you're always on. Times you sleep with your boots on, et cetera, et cetera. So I think with that mentality, it made investment banking, very easy, and just kind of like laughed at things. It was like, this is such a joke. This world like pales in comparison to what, other people are facing or what's happening in the Middle East, et cetera. And I had, had a brief stint there, maybe 2 years in investment banking, and ultimately, started working at a startup, doing battery technology for electric vehicles. And but I remember just the IDF was the hub of all these job opportunities that came to me. Just by synchronicity or the world working. How it works. There's a place in Boulder called the Highland City Club, and it's kind of like a Aspen Institute mixed with country club with co-working space and kind of like the Institute for like higher humanity. And I was asked to, present at a panel about the Israeli military and triangulating what makes it such an interesting and lethal fighting force. Like, why can that country, pound for pound, punch above its weight versus, all the other countries um, around it? And on the panel was this gentleman by the name of Eric Quiche, and he was a tank commander, 30 years ago. And we were on this panel and we talk, and he's a turnaround CEO, turned around, a dozen companies, had a multi-billion-dollar exit under his belt. And we kind of, after that seminar, we kind of stayed in touch, and he'd call me every now and again. And, one day he called me and said, okay, Eli, how much are you making in investment banking? And I told him. He's like, okay, well, I'll pay you half of what you're making, but I'll teach you everything I know. And you'll be under my wing and under my mentorship. And I said, okay, let's do it. And so I worked with Eric for 6 years, and he stayed true to his word. He taught me everything he knew, and I was kind of his right hand. And it's been, an amazing adventure. But then comes October 7th, and I think we can all remember where we were on October 7th. Like, where were you, Yuda?
I was at shul. I was celebrating like the end of Sukkot, beginning of Simchat Torah,
Mm-hmm.
and I didn't have my phone. And no one around me had their phone,
Yeah.
so it was just like whispers of rumors,
Mm-hmm.
and slowly a bigger picture started being formed. But I
Okay.
remember it very vividly.
And were you Shomer Shabbat at the time? Were you not looking at your phone?
Yeah, I wasn't looking at my phone.
Okay.
I was watching people around me who had family or
Okay.
friends. Israelis were getting hit the hardest. Very clear picture
Yeah.
to me.
Okay. Yes.
Where were you?
I was at home and I woke up and I made a coffee and sat on my couch and opened up my phone, and I realized that we woke up to a very different reality. And I'm in a WhatsApp group, excuse me, a WhatsApp group with my whole reserve team, and I saw dozens of messages from there and basically, read the headlines and immediately put down my phone, started packing my bag, and was thinking, okay, well, this is everything that we train for. In the army, like in during our active years, you're training, and kids are kind of joking around or not paying attention, and the instructors at the time or the commander would say, it heeds you well to pay attention, because you will be going to war at least once in your lifetime. Maybe not this year or next year or the year after, but I promise you, you will be going to war. So pay attention to this particular lesson because it will serve you. And they were right. And on October 7th, I think we all knew that we were going to war, and my team got mobilized. And so I just felt like it wasn't even a choice. It was like just a moral obligation to go and to serve. And I packed a bag, and if I read a lot of history and know that Israeli wars often don't they're not long in duration because the country can't sustain long wars. Because of the reserve forces, they're pulled out of their jobs, pulled out of the tech center, etc. So Israel traditionally fights very fast wars. So I pack a carry-on, a few pairs of underwear, a couple pairs of socks, thinking, okay, I'm gonna go. If I come back, it'll probably be in a month, 2 months, whatever. And my parents were away; they were on a European vacation. So I basically pack my bag and go to the airport and get a flight, and that was that. But I remember being at DIA, and they were calling the flight from Denver to Munich, and I was the last person aboard the plane because I realized that once I stepped foot on that plane, it is like being that monkey in the rocket and shooting yourself to space. It's like you do not. Once I step foot on that plane, you open up a whole new world of costs and consequences.
And everything that you had trained for was not mere training at this point. It was a real life
For
situation
sure.
of danger.
For sure. And on that plane, I wrote my will, and I sent it to my cousin to hold. I compiled all my bank informations and passwords, and I gave it to her and just said, "Hey, if anything happens to me, hold on to it all." And you realize that that might be it. That I might not be coming on the flight home. And I think everyone that showed up to fight, basically on October 7th and October 8th, they realize that. And I think everyone chooses to be there. And in these reserve units, there was like over 100% of people showed up. People that have been out of reserves for 5 or 10 years showed up, and basically some units ran out of rifles to give to soldiers because there were so many people that wanted to come to fight that this was basically the Super Bowl of everything that they've trained for. And that country, it's a young country. They've had a lot of wars, but this was the war of all wars, or about to be. And no one knew what would happen with Gaza, with Lebanon, with Iran, with the axis of resistance, etc. And so went to Israel, and the first couple weeks, it's surreal. Israel's bombing Gaza, they're preparing, you're packing your bag, you're zeroing in your rifles. As a sniper team, we have long range, high caliber rifles, and so you're dialing them in. Get new technology, new scopes come out of the bunkers that you unwrap and you train with. And basically, my team was slated to go into Lebanon if that war was to occur. And we're all kind of waiting to see if Hezbollah would join the fight, and ultimately they did, but it wasn't a ground invasion immediately. So we were running missions in and out of the West Bank, in Tulkarm, Jenin, Kabatia, Balata, all of these places. Alphabet soup of hotspots in the West Bank. And then they told us, okay, it's your turn to go into Gaza. And fought mostly in the Khan Yunis neighborhood of Gaza, which is Sinwar's hometown. So they fight pretty intensely over, the hometown of your leader.
Yeah.
And so I thought I'd be in Israel for 1 or 2 months, but was there for 6 months. And yeah, came home, and so many experiences and so many emotions to share. But uh, it's the IDF, they teach you how to fight. They teach you how to fight war in every single landscape and domain, and with different types of weaponry, etc. But they don't often teach you how to come home from war. And I think that transition has been more difficult than the war itself in a lot of ways. I think for most Israelis, but also for the guys like me that live abroad but just showed up. Where I came home in March of last year, and I show up and I'm back in Boulder and I'm just a regular guy. But I just endured all these experiences, and I have all this. It's just hard to kind of connect after that, or hard to share, because that was my reality, was not my parents' reality or my sister or etc. And even though like for yourself, like you're fighting the war here in Boulder, with anti-Semitism, and it's just as gnarly as over there, if not more so. But that's ultimately how I was able to connect with my family and my, sister and friend group was, when I was over there in Gaza and in all these places, my family was at, kind of holding down the home front, and the war here was even more intense in some ways. I don't know how it felt for you and continues to
Yeah,
feel for you.
in some ways, but in a very different way.
Hmm.
Um, I think it was hard for our community to feel so separate from what's going on in Israel. We almost like our hearts are there, but we're
Hmm.
living our normal lives here. Similar to what you said about how being away from the heart of everything going on. It's like how do I go back into business,
Yeah.
into school or whatever it be. Um, I wanna I wanna just learn a little bit more about your experience
Hmm.
during the war
Hmm.
because you've given me the backstory and
Yeah.
here you are now. But you were there for how many months in
Uh,
Gaza?
in Gaza, like you go in and out, in and out. But in I was in the war for about just under 6 months.
Got it. And so that first day that you went in,
Hmm.
you're unsure what's going to happen.
Yeah.
Uh, Probably a lot of emotions coming up, and
Hmm.
you're with surrounded by people who are going through the same experience. Your team, your closest guys.
Yeah.
How did you navigate that internally so that you could be the best possible support for your brothers and your team, and so that you could accomplish the mission that you were there to do?
Yeah. I think like the prospect of, you know, going into Gaza and like going into war, it's like such a heightened state of awareness and a heightened state of vibration. And I think as men, there's something in our DNA code that clicks. That's for as long as that, for as long as there have been humans on this planet, we have been fighting each other, in one extent or the other. So I think there was something very familiar about going to war with your friends, and your friends there are the family that you choose, and to go there and go into Gaza, and it's basically Gaza is like post-apocalyptic meets the surface of the moon, and it's just lawless. It's complete and utter destruction, and but you're with your family and you're going there and you don't know how long you're going in for, what experiences you're going to endure, but you go in together and you hope that you all come out together. And I remember before we went into Gaza, we're at some staging area, like on a kibbutz Be'eri, waiting, like you're packing your gear. The whole convoy comes to kind of pick you up, to give you your ride, to give you your lift into Gaza, and all the cars are idling, and you're loading the round into the chamber, checking your mags, grenades, etc. And you basically get one last phone call, because you're not allowed phones in Gaza or any device with Bluetooth, especially in the early days of the war. So before you go to Gaza, before you go in, you kind of give your phone to the logistics officer and he keeps it, safe while you're there. And I already turned in my phone because I didn't have anyone to call. I don't even think I told my family I was going into Gaza this time. I just was like, okay, whatever. I'm going to get my gear ready. Meanwhile, my best friend his name is Tom, and we've been together since basic training and in sniper school. And you're always in sniper school, you're always have a partner, a sniper and a spotter, and you rotate between those roles. So I was always with Tom. Um, and Tom recently got engaged, and his fiance, is lovely. And basically, Tom had his last phone call, and he called his fiance Vanessa, and they're talking. And meanwhile, Tom taps me on the shoulder and he says, "Eli, take the phone. Vanessa wants to talk to you." And I'm like, "I can't. Like, I got to get ready." He's like, "No, no, she wants to talk to you." So I take the phone and I kind of walk a few steps away, and I can tell that she's crying and she's shooken up. And she says, "Eli, just promise me one thing. Promise me that you'll bring Tom home." And I said, "Okay, I promise I'll bring Tom home." And I hung up the phone and I gave it back to Tom. And Tom's like, "What did she want?" And I'm like, "Oh, nothing, just to wish us good luck." And in that moment, I knew I was going to do anything I could to get Tom home. And I think that's kind of what, in many ways, got me through it, because when you go into Gaza, you open up a can of worms of experiences and traumas you might endure and what you might inflict on others, and you just take it day by day. And I realize whatever I have to do to get out of this place with Tom, I'm gonna do it no matter what. As snipers, I think it's challenging in terms of the ethical and moral dilemmas you face and the decisions you have to make in a quick succession of time. And I just realized whatever I need to do to get Tom home is it's going to be the right decision. So I think that's how I've made sense of some aspects of the war that at the time maybe didn't sit right or were kind of the most difficult was, well, it got me to bring Tom home. And it got, me home to my family and, the rest of my team home to theirs. So I think with that in mind, it's like that's all that matters. And that's like the frame of reference that I reflect on the war is like we all got out of it basically by the skin of our teeth. And there is so much luck involved. This is something that I didn't know about and I didn't learn about until experiencing it firsthand. Sure, it matters how good of a soldier you are and your tactics, but it matters luck. And I think your karma or whatever we call it, or divine intervention, if, some guys in my team are more religious, but it is luck. If you go into a building and you don't know if it's booby trapped or not, or I remember one time, a bullet missed my head by, a couple centimeters and, if, my head was over here, I wouldn't be home. And it's like, what makes those moments, what it's insane. And I think for people that might have had like life or death moments in their life or, real points of tension, there's just so much luck involved. And I think that is incredibly scary because, when it's your time, it's your time. And you just have to do everything you can in the meantime.
Do you think it's luck, or do you think it's part of, I guess, a bigger plan? Because something, and this is a different note,
Sure.
not to like compare it all, but something that I've heard like Holocaust survivors talk about, for example,
Mm-hmm.
is I'm alive because I was one of the lucky few that made it out, right? And from like a logical
Mm-hmm.
perspective, that makes sense. Like you drew the right stick out of the deck.
Yeah.
Um, but on the other hand, I like in Judaism in
Mm-hmm.
particular, we do believe in this idea of like divine providence, that there is a plan in place and that everything happens for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
Um, does that play into what you see as luck, or how does that work in your mind?
I don't know. It's that's a tough question. I'm not religious and you know more about the Torah than I do, by far, but I think it's as simple as like whether you go left or you go right. And it's just a decision, right? It's binary, like you left or right. And, the one way could be an IED and, your whole team can get blown up, or the other way could be, nothing in a clear path. So I don't know if that's what you're referencing or like what makes me choose to go left other than right. But at the end of the day, you pick and that's what happens. And I call it luck, or I,
Sure.
think we build our own karma and we make our own luck to a certain degree. But I also know, a couple guys that went into Gaza and never came out. And I thought that they were, the most stand up individuals on this planet. And, I would think, it's hard to make sense of it. Um,
Not that we can make
yeah.
sense of it. You can't give. I mean, it's the question of that we all ask of
Yeah.
why do bad things happen to good people. We may not know.
Mm-hmm.
We may not have an exact answer, but I think for you shared something profound, and a quote that I bring up a lot of the times on this podcast
Mm-hmm.
relates to it. He who has a why to live can bear almost anyhow. And what I'm hearing from your story, from what you shared, is that from the moment you got that phone call from Tom's
Mm-hmm.
fiance, you made it your mission not only to complete your task, but also to bring Tom home.
Yeah.
And that became your why. You transcended your own need to
Yeah.
live for him. I think that's incredibly profound. I think that's what can get a lot of people through these
Yeah,
circumstances.
and I think we didn't need a why. As every soldier or every Jew, like we don't need a why. We know why.
Yeah,
October 7th was why. When we were in Gaza, there'd be intel that like there's hostages under our feet, somewhere within a couple hundred meters. There's hostages, alive, most likely under our feet. And so why you're there. You want to bring home every single hostage. And I know that if it's that was the mission, and obviously before we went into Gaza, you're briefed by a general and you kind of form a chet, like a semicircle. And the general's like, this war is going to be different from any war that we've ever fought and any war, any combat that we've ever been in. And basically, um, you can't kill the idea of Hamas, but you can kill every single Hamasnik you see. So he encouraged us to pack our bags heavy full of ammo and grenades and take some extra before we loaded up to basically bring death to their doorstep. And that's what we were trained to do, especially as snipers. None of us are illusion to our task at hand, and that's what we did, and that's why we serve to some extent. But it's to bring all the hostages home, to finish the war, and make sure something like that can never happen again. So that was the why. And then with Tom, that was, Tom and I would, sleep on the ground together every day, or take turns, to go running through the different stations. And he's my best friend and family that I choose. So that was kind of the icing on the cake. And every time I looked at Tom, it was a constant reminder of, well, anything I needed to do to get him home was the right thing for myself.
So throughout your time, through the months of being in and out of Gaza,
Mhm.
and I've heard you share some of these stories before when you've spoken to our community, um, were there moments during combat? As a sniper, you
Mhm.
obviously have to make quick decisions. Were there difficult moments for you to make those split second decisions, and how did you make those under
Mhm.
such pressure?
I think, well, first, the IDF trains soldiers and their snipers extremely well. So things become muscle memory. It's like driving a car. You'll never forget how to drive a car. You might forget like how to, shift properly and make it like a seamless transition between gears, but you never forget how to drive. But so I remember, like, as snipers, you remember all the shots you take, and I think more profoundly, the shots that you don't take, for a variety of reasons. So a couple instances that stand out to me are some shots that I didn't take when I could have, and maybe I should have. One is like we were in a particular neighborhood of Gaza where the entire neighborhood has been evacuated of civilians. There's no one there. They've all been evacuated to different humanitarian camps. So basically, anyone you see in this area is technically a combatant. It doesn't matter if it's a Hamas fighter, in uniform, or a 60-year-old woman with a radio. You see someone and they're a combatant. And I remember one time you're just looking down a street, you're there in a particular nest, sniper's nest for a couple days, you're not moving, you're just watching an intersection, or a breezeway, from one building down to 800 meters or something. And, suddenly a kid pops out, or, kid, 10-year-old kid. And by rules of engagement, like, this kid is technically a combatant because Hamas could have, taken this kid and said, okay, go run into the middle of the street and radio us, or, signal us if you see, the IDF, and tell us which building they're in, or like, they're in a building, above the red awning or whatever.
And then your team's at risk.
Yeah, your team's at risk. So that's why if you see someone, they're a combatant, because there's no reason for civilians to be there. The whole place has been evacuated. It's a ghost town. Things are destroyed. It's just rubble. So if someone's there, they likely have malintent, and that's why they're a combatant. And Hamas does, send kids in, or women, or people that aren't the typical Hamas fighter. And by rules of engagement, this kid is a combatant because I don't know what he has in his pocket or in his backpack, etc. But there's a piece of concrete like the size of an apple right by his foot, and I just instinctually just shot at that piece of concrete and exploded it right on his shin, to let him know, like, hey, like, I see you, there's snipers in the neighborhood, like, basically just leave and don't come back. So this kid ran as fast as he could. I've never seen Usain Bolt run, other than like Olympic trials, but this guy ran so fast and just went out of my field of fire, and that was that. But it's like those little moments, those couple seconds where you decide and you make decisions, and you have to live with those decisions. And in that moment, I realized I'm not going to kill this kid if I don't have to. I don't see anything in his pocket. I don't see a weapon. But basically, how can I just tell this kid to get out of here, as overtly as I can? And so that's what I did. So I remember those little things, and those, you experience things like that on a daily level, you know, for weeks and then months, and it just compounds on itself like sedimentary rock. And then, after the war, it's like, oh yeah, I do remember that. I do remember that time. But I think that's what makes, you know, us as Jews, where we value life. Maybe other militaries, people would make different decisions, but to, to value life, every life. And it's like, if you save one life, you save the world. So I don't think about this kid often, but I realize you realize what power you have in your hands as snipers, and how personal it is, right? Because you see someone and you zoom in times 40 focus, and you can see, like, oh, that kid has acne on his face. You could kind of know what some type of sunglasses he has, and it's like a very intimate, deep experience. But those are the things, those are decisions, or that you live with, whether the if you pull the trigger or you don't.
And I do like and agree with what you said about, as Jews, we do value life and we do preserve life.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole reason you were there was because, in the chance that you find a live hostage underneath your feet, you want to bring them home, you want to get them to safety, but you also want to protect your team.
Yeah. And it's objectively one of the most complex wars ever fought, because you're fighting in one of the most densely populated places on earth. You're fighting Hamas, which is, a ragtag group that oftentimes they don't wear uniforms. They embed themselves in, civilian centers. They do use human shields. It's like Ukraine, where they also have drones that fly above and can drop things on you. And then there's the whole subterranean arena as well, which makes like what the North Vietnamese had, in the Vietnam War, look elementary. And so you have hundreds of miles of tunnels under your feet. So it's essentially a four-dimensional warfare. And they have, hostages, and the US gives Israel a certain timeline, and everyone has, cell phones, and you're being recorded, and you have to fight as morally, as ethically, as quickly as you can. And I think that's what the IDF achieved. And it's extremely complicated on every level, down from the guys on the ground to the ones making the decisions or flying the jets overhead. But
Yeah, and I can see why, now that you've kind of explained this experience of
mhm.
yours, why it would be harder to come back into Boulder daily life after living this way.
Yeah.
These are high intensity, high cost scenarios where you have to make these split second decisions. And I feel like we get very caught up in the small things in our daily life
Yeah.
in Boulder, where we have everything we need, and the smallest thing can throw our day off. And it's important to hear stories like this, stories of sacrifice, at least your time and your
Mm-hmm.
energy that you
Mm-hmm.
spent doing something like this. Because in our daily life, it's so easy to forget all that we do have. I
Yeah.
mean, it's a beautiful day out today in Boulder, and I'm just sitting here and I'm thankful for everything that has been given to me today.
Yeah.
And we don't realize that there's people in all other areas of the world that may be facing these extreme challenges,
Mm-hmm.
extreme struggles.
And I think for us, the challenge is like, how do we expand our barometer of experiences so we know, for example, I know I've never been as cold, as hungry, as afraid, as fearful as I was like in the military. So now that I come back to Boulder, it makes everything else so much easier, or so much, smoother, because my barometer have been expanded that degree. And I think that's what, travel can do. Or if you have, certain volunteer experiences, or you go out and you do something like really hard or challenging, it gives you more perspective, right? It makes you more grateful for the moment. But I think that's a challenge that, guys like me and you face on, where do we get these experiences from? How do we, like, that's something that we crave, that we're hungry for. And I think a lot of us are left like, how do we do that? Where do we gain these perspectives? Um,
A lot of the
so,
times through discipline.
mhm.
Discipline is freedom. When we can, yeah, maybe we don't need to go and fight in a war. That
Mhm.
was your calling to serve. For some people, it's other things. For my
Sure.
friend Theo, it was to go to Israel. For
Mhm.
me, it's doing what I'm doing on campus. Everyone
Yeah.
has their own way to do it. But by laying out a training of sorts and a curriculum for ourselves to
Mhm.
follow and to adhere to, it can bring a lot of beauty and freedom into our lives in places that we may not expect, or things that we may neglect or overlook.
Yeah. Well said.
Yeah. Um, so, as someone who's coming from our world in Boulder, you've spent your time in
Mhm.
Israel and now you're back. What's your message for the Jewish community in America, or the young man who may be trying to, find that area of discipline where he can give himself over to and
Yeah.
serve?
I'd say to just have as much like kindness and self-compassion as possible, and to give yourself a lot of grace as you navigate this, because finding these things are challenging. Finding what you want to do next, the next track, it's extremely challenging, and we feel pressure from ourselves, from our parents, from society, etc. So I think to give yourself a long leash to feel all the feels, and to, you know, just kind of feel your way through it slowly or methodically, or sometimes it feels like you're taking a step back, or you're going making a wide detour around. But I'd just say to go slow and breathe through it, and just, that is the that's all you can do, right? And lean on people that you have, like find someone that's, in your corner, unwavering, and mentors, and ask them questions, and don't be afraid to ask for help, because I think a lot of us, especially myself, like I want to do everything by myself and for myself, but I'm trying to get better asking for help from others, or saying, hey, like this, I don't feel well, like I am not okay, or things like that. So and to cultivate a safe space to do that in a community where they can actually help you through it. um, but they're hard, those communities are hard to find, but you have to make them yourself.
Yeah, you do have to create them. In a team in combat, you can't
Mm-hmm.
afford to keep any concerns to yourself because it may put your teammates' life at stake.
For sure.
I think we should adopt a similar attitude in our inner circles, maybe a lower stakes scenario, but if there's something that is of concern with us, whether it's in our lives or in our communities, we need to bring some light to it. We need to address it and be real, even though it's not the easiest thing to do, because maybe it's not life or death. But it certainly is crucial in building a strong community and a strong sense of self as well.
Yeah, it sounds hokey, but to like encourage vulnerability, and vulnerability kind of evokes more vulnerability. Like if I share something like deeply personal with you, you're going to feel like you want to reciprocate to me, with something else. And that kind of creates, a little bit of, connection, and kind of, I think that's where it's born, right? But to be vulnerable, and to be the first person to be vulnerable, right? And share. Like if someone asks you, hey, Yuda, how are you? You can say, actually, today, I'm actually not doing well. This is what's going on. And it kind of just brings you a little bit closer. And that's how you cultivate those connections, at least, for me. And I think just to check in on one another as well, and to, ask people how they are. And if they give you like, oh, I'm good, be like, no, like, how are you really? Because there's a lot there. There's a lot of subcurrents, under the surface. And I think if you ask the right question, you can kind of unlock answers you wouldn't get otherwise. So I think the quality of someone's answer depends on the quality of your question.
Absolutely. Well, brother, appreciate you coming on and taking the time to share your experience. Again, vulnerability is exactly what you're practicing right now. And I hope that, just one person listening, just like you said, one life saved, saving the world. One person listening can benefit from your story, and can begin to veer off of the path that's been laid out for them, and heed their call to service. And I really appreciate everything you had to say, man.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks, Yuta.
Thank you.